Nimrod's Shadow is a book about an artist called T.F. Riley who lives in a district of London called Old Cross with his mangy dog, the Nimrod of the title. He's fairly penurious, hasn't had much reputation. His best friend's called Mountjoy, who owns a cafe. Riley owes Mountjoy quite a lot of money, so they decide to have an exhibition in the cafe. A critic called Gower comes a couple of days before the exhibition to value the work. On the way home, he's discovered dead, drowned in a local canal, and the clues lead back to Riley. There's another story intertwined with this, which takes place in 1911. There's a contemporary story of a woman called Samantha who one day finds a painting in a gallery and falls in love with it. It's a painting by the artist T.F. Riley. The two stories eventually come together, and Nimrod plays quite a major part in that, which I can't really reveal. The book takes place in two separate time periods. One of them's around sort of just before the First World War, and one of them's contemporary. I started off thinking this was just going to be a book about Riley, about 1913, about artistic integrity, about people who haven't got an artistic reputation, who weren't selling pretty much a lot of the things that this fiction uncovered initiatives indeed about. You know, this is a guy who, he's a good painter, but nobody knows who he is, you know, and he could well end up living in obscurity for all of his life. So I followed Riley for 3 chapters, and then it seemed to me that this other character came to me, this character called Samantha, contemporary woman in Soho, works as a legal secretary. And she just seemed to impose herself on the narrative. So I realised that she was quite a major character. So I decided to follow her a bit, and she led me along a narrative path that I did want to follow. So I ended up rocking between the two time frames, between Samantha and between Riley. And every time I learnt something about Riley, I learnt a little bit more about Samantha. And I ended up hopefully telling the stories of these two people separated by about a century, but drawn together by one painting. I did a lot of research for this book. I've written 9 novels, and some of them have been historical, some of them have been contemporary, but all of them involve a certain degree of research. I wanted to try and pin down that period just before the First World War, and I also wanted to pin down what life would be like inside a prison at that time. And I did a lot of research about the daily life of a prison. There are a lot of documents around. But I also wanted to get a flavour of the times, that sort of brooding period before the First World War. So I read quite a lot of novels set around that period just to get a taste and a feel for it. I think it's important to wear research lightly. As soon as you read a line that you think has been researched, the spell has been broken. I think it's important not to put any facts in a historical novel that you wouldn't put in a contemporary novel. Because once you do, then people go, well, that's an interesting fact. How did he know that? And it takes you away from the story. So, as I say, I think you have to be very careful with the stuff that you research and how you put it into the text. I think publishing's changed over the last 15, 16 years. I think the days of huge advances have gone. I think publishers are being much more cautious about the money they're spending on novelists. I think the amount of attention novelists are getting is reducing. I think the amount of coverage novels are getting in the press is reducing. It's harder to get space, to get reviewed nowadays. It's harder to get attention. And initiatives like the Booker and Richard and Judy shine a very bright spotlight on a very few people. But what that means is everybody else falls into a darker shadow, and it's very hard to get attention. I mean, you know, a lot of writers will say that. So initiatives such as Fiction Uncovered are really, really important for those, the great majority of writers who really do spend most of their lives in obscurity. You know, you read about novelists who earn massive advances, who have massive sales. But that then becomes self-perpetuating. The novelists who start off with fewer sales and smaller advances tend to get fewer and fewer readers and earn less and less money. So the disparity between the stars and the mid-list or low-list writers gets broader and broader. Writing for almost every writer I know is a strange sort of compulsion. You feel slightly guilty if a day's gone by and you haven't written. It feels like almost a terrible thing to say, but the day has been wasted in some way. When you're writing a novel, it's always on in the background of your head. It's like the sort of pilot light's always on, and you spend as much time probably in that strange parallel world as you do in the real world. It's always cooking all the time. With Nimrod's Shadow, it's a very complicated interleaved plot, and I found that my sort of unconscious mind was making a lot of the decisions for me, so I'd get to a tricky plot point, and then the next morning I'd wake up and find it was solved. But it was an interesting book to write. For me, the process always starts with a strange sensory thing. It's not necessarily a character, it's almost like a taste or a colour or a smell of a period, and then that coalesces into a place or a character, and then you try and write the character on the page, and if they're real, they start leading you by the hand through that fictional journey, and if they're not, then they just sort of vanish into the mist and the book dies. But with Riley, I knew him very well from quite an early stage, and the more I got to know him, the more he led me on this journey.